YouTube straight away. Okay. How do I get back to Zoom? Can you believe it? It's already Chav Zayin Order this week, eh? Unbelievable.
Yeah. And Chav Hey Order.
Where does that tradition come from to tell a story in Matzah Shabbos? Was that the Baal Shem Tov?
Yeah, yeah.
You have to face it so anyone walks this way and he has to be on your camera.
Pass me the thing there, that big book. Oh, yeah. Good luck, everybody. And thank you so much for joining the webinar. As I've said time and time again, to tell stories of tzaddikim on Matzah Shabbos, many, many brachas to the world. Rabbi Karlebach is taking us on the most amazing journey, stories of the Rebbe and the Rebbe's lifetime. I remember in 1982, Tovshin Mem Beis, when the Rebbe turned 80, the Rebbe finished speaking, I think it was about 1:30 in the morning, and then the Rebbe wanted to give everybody a book. He wanted to give everybody a Tanya there. Without showing any sign of weakness, the Rebbe gave everybody a book this weight. He looked at everybody till about 8, 9 in the morning, not showing any sign of tiredness, weakness, etc., etc. The Rebbe was superhuman. But I think the greatest quality of the Rebbe was the Rebbe's selflessness. He was absolutely selfless. The Rebbe cared for every single human being throughout the world. And to go on a journey of the Rebbe's life is an absolute honor. So Rabbi Karlebach, thank you for doing this. And over to you.
Good talk, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi Masinta. And we'll be telling stories and the Rebbe's life story leading up to his birthday in Yud Nisan. I would just like to point out that this week will be the 25th of Adar, and in 1901, on the 25th of Adar, the Rebbetzin, Chaim Mushke, the Rebbe's wife, was born. So she would be 120 this year. As Rabbi Masinta mentioned, it's a very big schus and a very big source of bracha to tell stories of tzaddikim. And GEM, Jewish Educational Media, put out a beautiful weekly story of an account of a little girl with the Rebbe. And here is this story. It is by a Mrs. Shalamis Saxon. She says, when she was reaching bar mitzvah, she heard that there's a custom to write to the Rebbe for a bracha for the occasion. And since she was relatively new to Chabad, she thought that you can't just take, you have to give as well. So in asking for a bracha from the Rebbe, it would be nice if you gave something too. And that is the way her 12-year-old mind worked, she said. This happened in 1981. She knew that the Rebbe was childless, and I decided to give him a bracha for children. Even though I knew that the Rebbe was close to 80, I didn't see that as a problem. After all, we read in the Torah that Avram had Yitzchak when he was 100 years old, and Hashem could do anything. But I was shy to write this outright. I wasn't sure if the Rebbe read his letters first or if his secretaries read them first. And by the way, that's why the Rebbe was the only one to open his mail and read them, exactly so people shouldn't be shy. But the girl says, I didn't know anything. And I didn't know if anyone else would read what I wrote. And maybe they might not even give my letter to him if they felt that a bracha to the Rebbe from a little girl was not appropriate. So I decided to write that part of the letter in Hebrew code. Now, there are a number of systems where the Hebrew letters are exchanged with each other according to methods. The most famous is called Atbash, that instead of an aleph, you take the last letter Tov. Instead of a base, you take the second last letter Shin. And there are many others. And I wrote out my bracha in regular wording, and then my younger brother helped me to put it into code. And I wrote the following in normal Hebrew. In 3 days' time, on the 6th of Tishrei, I will have my bat mitzvah. And I wish to receive a blessing from the Rebbe for the coming years when I will be obligated in the mitzvahs of a woman. I also wish to receive a bracha to succeed in all that I do, to bring the final redemption closer in time. And I concluded by writing in big letters across the page, I want Mashiach now. And then, after that, in code, I wrote the following in Hebrew. Berchosi leharebe, sheyivoled loy bonim, af al pi sheloi nigzer al kach. This is my blessing to the Rebbe, that he should have children in Yirtzeh Hashem, even if this had not been decreed for him. A little while later, I received a letter from the Rebbe, addressed to me, dated Vov Tishrei, the day of my bat mitzvah. And he wrote in Hebrew as I wrote. In answer to your letter, in which you write that you have reached the age of 12, which is a time of bat mitzvah, may it be God's will that you accept upon yourself the yoke of heaven, the yoke of mitzvahs with a full heart. May Hashem bless you to be successful in your studies, in your activities. You should grow to be worthy of being called a daughter of Chabad, in keeping with the will of our holy Rebbes. You should also influence your friends through your words, and even more so, through your example as a daughter of Israel who is educated in Hasidic teachings. And may this bring you spiritual and physical satisfaction. The Rebbe's signature followed this. And then, all the way at the bottom of the page, there was a phrase I couldn't make out. It seemed gibberish. I thought it might be some sort of internal reference like you see on business letters. But when I showed it to my brother, he said, "What are you talking about?" This is the Rebbe's answer to your blessing in the same code that you used. In code, it says, Toda al habracha. Thank you for your blessing. Now, being 12 years old, I thought, wow, that is so neat of the Rebbe to do that. And I framed that letter. It's up on my wall. However, she says, I didn't realize the true significance of what transpired until I was older. Here is a Rebbe, a holy man who spent his days in prayer and Torah study, and of course, with everything else involved in leading Chabad. He spent his nights meeting with people, and in between answering untold number of letters personally. My bat mitzvah, Vov Tishrei, was on his mother's yahrzeit. And it was during the busiest time of the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur between in Aseret Yemei Tshuva. Yet on that very day, our Rebbe answered my letter, which I find absolutely mind-boggling. Here, I was just a little girl, not from an important family. Nevertheless, the Rebbe read my letter carefully, taking the time to decipher that message in code and then going to the trouble of responding in the same code. When the significance of this all dawned on me years later, I realized how much I mattered to the Rebbe, even though he did not know me or my family personally. I mattered simply because I was a Jew. The Rebbe interacted with people from all walks of life. It didn't matter what their profession was. It didn't matter if they were religious or not. It didn't matter if they had Torah knowledge or were versed in Hasidic writings. It didn't matter who they were, what their social standing, what their age was. If they were a human being, as they were a human being, Hashem, the Rebbe, treated them with respect and kindness. And she says, that is something I try to pass on to people I interact with. We should not limit our love and caring to those who are like us, or to those who live in our community, or to our relatives, or to those we can benefit from. We need to really care about each other, one and all, and extend ourselves as the Rebbe taught us to be. And she has at the bottom of this letter the 3 words that the Rebbe wrote back. And it is Daled Yud Kuf Aleph Daled, Chaf Samach, and Daled Gimel Hey Shien, which is Toda al Habracha. Amazing, amazing story. But let's get back to the story of the Rebbe's life as told by Professor Branover in his book, The Ultimate Jew. Right after the Rebbe's wedding in 1928, it was, Tafresh Peites, the 14th of Kislev, the Rebbe and his young wife left Warsaw for Berlin. At the University of Berlin, he worked for many doctoral degrees in several fields, including physics, engineering, and philosophy. One can only imagine what sacrifice it took, especially from the Rebbe's young wife. In the courtyard, in the chutzner of the previous Rebbe, she obviously had many family friends, and here her world shrunk to the size of the tiny 1-bedroom apartment. One of the few people who remembers the Rebbe in Berlin recounts that the rabbi would occasionally join him at his table at the local kosher restaurant. He never engaged in petty conversation or small talk. He didn't discuss the food. He ate, but it was as if the food did not exist for him. Usually he was silent. When he did talk, it was about Torah. Another Jew who attended the University of Berlin together with the future Rebbe relates, the university had many Jewish students. He was the only one who always wore a yarmulke and a beret, despite the strict German university rules that forbade the wearing of any headgear during lectures. And in the lecture hall, he usually sat on the last bench, holding an open Talmud on his knees. While living in Berlin, the Rebbe kept up a regular correspondence with his father-in-law, and visited him on several occasions. In fact, in 1929, as we've already discussed, when the previous Rebbe was visiting America for quite a few years, the Rebbe came to Poland to preside in the Chutzner of the Frierke Rebbe over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur Verbringens. In 1933, when the Nazis in Yamach Shemam came to Germany, came to power, the Rebbe and his wife left for Berlin, left Berlin for Paris. They rented a small one-bedroom flat in the city center, and he enrolled at the Sorbonne, where he studied physics, and at the Polytechnic Institute's Faculty of Mechanical Engineering. Even when the Second World War broke out, the Rebbe and his wife meticulously observed all Jewish laws and customs. When it came to prepare matzah, he did it exactly as his father had taught him, with no concessions to the circumstances. In fact, we are told he crossed the border to Switzerland, where he acquired wheat and ground it by hand. The Rebbitzin baked the matzah in a special oven built in their tiny kitchen for that purpose. And yet, they didn't keep the matzah for themselves. They distributed matzah to scores of Jews, and they even sent some to their father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, who was languishing in exile in remote Kazakhstan. And for Sukkot, the Rebbe built a sukkah in his building's courtyard next to the ground floor apartment. The journalist Zvi Sheffer says, I arrived in Paris and I was looking for a sukkah where I could eat a festive meal. During Chol Hamoed, I met the Rebbe and he asked me how I was doing. I told him I didn't find a place to be for Yom Tov for Sukkot. The Rebbe invited me to his sukkah. I was uneasy about accepting his offer. I knew that in these difficult times, having guests involved considerable problems. However, he insisted and I agreed to come. When I came, the sukkah turned out to be very small, with barely enough space for two. It was obvious that my presence would deprive the Rebbitzin of the opportunity to share the Yom Tov meal with her husband. I felt so uncomfortable. Yet the Rebbe behaved in a manner that made everything fall into place. I felt as if the walls of the sukkah had expanded, turning it into a magnificent palace. The Rebbe was sitting again across me, uttering pearls of wisdom, and I was brought to a whole different plateau. Though the Rebbe studied physics and engineering in Paris, most of his time was poring over the Torah. Secular studies took a very minor portion of his time, similar to the Rambam. A man who was at the Sorbonne at the same time says, once during a break, the Rebbe was sitting and learning the Gemara, and close by was a group of students excitedly discussing some issue raised at the lecture. The rabbi lifted his head from the book for a moment and solved their problem in a minute. The students were flabbergasted. They had seen how engrossed in the Gemara he was throughout the lecture. In the summer of 1940, the German army invaded France, and the Schneersons managed to flee Paris on one of the last trains to leave before the Germans captured the city. They made it to Vichy, where they stayed from the holiday of Shavuos until the end of summer, when they relocated to Nice. Italian authorities administered the city many Jewish refugees found safety there, but danger lurked in every corner. There were frequent curfews. Despite all the perils, the Rebbe endeavored to help Jews in every way he could. At that time, in order to check into a hotel, the Jew had to prove he had at least $100, a fortune at the time. The Rebbe kept a $100 bill in case such a situation would arise. When he roamed the streets, he met a Jewish refugee in need. He would give him the money. The Jew would show that $100 bill to the hotel manager and then somehow sneak it back to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would help another Jew with the same situation. Meanwhile, a lot of work was being done by the Frierdiker Rebbe in New York in order to get the proper visas for his children, the Rebbe and the Rebbitzin. Finally, the State Department agreed and they got the papers to go. And they wrote to the telegraph to the Rebbe that they booked the previous Rebbe, that they had a booking on the next ship. And the Rebbe said they got a telegram back from the Frierdiker Rebbe, don't sail on that ship. It was an odd message. Tickets were very difficult to come by, and it wasn't even certain there would be another ship. Obviously, our Rebbe obeyed his father-in-law, the previous Rebbe's instructions without hesitation. And as you can imagine, that ship was attacked by German submarines. There were no survivors. Finally, our Rebbe did manage to leave France and reached America via Spain and Portugal. Upon arriving in America, as we've already spoken about, the Rebbe was put into charge of Machne Yisrael, Kahos, Agudas, and other organizations by his father-in-law, but it seems like he didn't want to make a living through that, so he immersed himself in work. According to Rabbi Leibel Bistritsky, the Rebbe's day was divided into two parts. Every morning at 7, he left home and set out for the Brooklyn shipyard, where he worked as a shipbuilding engineer. An interesting little event is by Popular Science cover story. It's in May 1997, page 54 to 59. And there they talk about an ingenious device invented at the Brooklyn shipyard during the Second World War for making airplanes attacking submarines practically invisible. The code name, says the Popular Science story, of the invention was the Hebrew name for Jew, Yehudi. Details of this invention are still classified, but there is strong evidence that this invention was made by our Rebbe, even though the majority of his time was devoted, as you know, in developing the Chabad institutions. And the Rebbe was under the direct supervision of his father-in-law, and their unique relationship grew stronger day by day. In 1944, several months after the Rebbe's father passed away, the Rebbe's in Alma Ata, the Rebbe's mother moved to Kraskova, not far from Moscow. She needed a special permit, which she didn't have, and somehow she managed to move to Lvov. And at that time, there was a deal between Russia and Poland to allow all Polish citizens to leave Russia, get away from Stalin, and some Hasidim forged papers. One of them was Reb Mendel Futterfass, by the way, who was arrested and jailed for it. And the Rebbitzin was one of the fortunate people who managed to flee the Soviet Union through this escape route. And from Poland, she relocated to Paris in 1947. That is the only time that we know of that our Rebbe, since coming to New York from 1941 till his passing in 1994, left New York. The Rebbe traveled from New York to Paris to meet his mother, whom he had not seen for 20 years. The Hasidim who lived in Paris at the time would cherish the heartwarming memory of this meeting with his mother. The Hasidim arranged a Farbrengen, during which the Rebbe spoke about Yosef, the son of our patriarchs, who met his father again after a 22-year separation. However, as soon as he began to talk, he couldn't contain his feelings and he burst into tears. The Rebbitzin stayed at a cousin, Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, in Paris. Actually, he is the father of Rebbitzin Hadassah Karlbach, who married my cousin. And that Rebbitzin Hadassah and the Rebbe's wife, had quite a close relationship. The Rebbitzin stayed in Paris for 3 months, from Purim until Shavuos. During that time, our Rebbe was there organizing her papers to get into New York. He visited his mother every morning and every evening. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, he would walk from his apartment to hers, have davener to shul there, and have the meal with his mother. During his time in Paris, he would frequently deliver discourses to eager audiences. There were people like Rabbi Zion Shem Tov and others who got their first glimpse into the personality of the Rebbe, realizing who he was. His talks were deep, a whole new way of speaking, and filled with simple and boundless faith, and inevitably concluded with practical advice. You know, from his Rishimis, this would be similar to the Farbrengens later. On one occasion, the Rebbe came to a shul filled with people, with prominent rabbis and mentors. Despite his youth, he already had enormous respect in the Jewish world. Rumors of his genius, incredible learning, and piety were spreading in increasingly wide circles. After Mincha, the Rebbe asked the worshippers what topic were they studying. They were told it was Ein Yaakov. The Rebbe took the book, immersed himself in it for several minutes, and then delivered a 2-hour discourse based on the book, discussing the Haggadah, Kabbalah, Jewish philosophy. After Maidav, they asked him to continue. At first he declined, but then he saw how the people were eager to hear the words of Torah. He agreed, and he asked again, what do they usually learn after Maidav? He was told they learn about the tefillin from the Shulchan Aruch of the Alter Rebbe. He spent an hour talking on that subject, and then they told him that they're also learning Tanya Perek Mem Aleph. The Rebbe agreed once again. And then, when he was finishing his talk, he fused all the lessons from all 3 books, the Ein Yaakov, the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch on Tefillin, and the Tanya Perek Mem Aleph into an integral whole. Everybody was amazed. They had never heard anyone speak like that before. They were particularly struck by the Rebbe's unique ability to find a common denominator in such seemingly unrelated topics and to blend them together. In this, while he was speaking, the Rebbe quoted hundreds of passages verbatim without pausing for a moment. Familiar concepts suddenly acquired a whole new meaning, one that the listeners had never suspected before. And at the end of it, he rose, stood up, excused himself humbly, and said he had to visit his mother. Once during that time, the Rebbe asked a member of the Paris Chabad community, "Why aren't you doing anything to spread the message of Judaism?" And the guy said, "The atmosphere in Paris in 1947 is not conducive to spiritual life. They can't do anything about it." The Rebbe said, "There's plenty that can be done. Come with me and you'll see how simple it is." They headed for one of the city's main streets in a section with a large Jewish population. The Rebbe climbed atop a crate and began to wave a handkerchief. Curious people gathered around, and he began to talk to them, urging them not to forget their Jewish roots and to observe the commandments. His simple, boundless sincerity had their effect. His words stirred the listeners, even those who were far from Judaism. Many felt they were rediscovering something infinitely familiar and close to their hearts, but for some reason had remained hidden until then. So many people had tears in their eyes. After the Rebbe's speech, everyone joined in mincha. Many Jews there hadn't uttered a word of prayers in years. Just before he left, the Rebbe led a farbrengen that lasted well into the morning hours. And then Rebbe, his wife, and his mother sailed to America. In New York, the Rebbitzin would live less than 2 blocks from her son in 1414 President Street in an apartment which later became the dormitory. He visited his mother every single day until her passing, every day, no matter how busy his schedule was. He took interest in her affairs and sometimes ate at her home. And he continued his usual routine even after the Rebbe. He became Rebbe. He had a key to his mother's apartment, and to save her the trouble of opening the door for him. People relate how on Shabbos and Yom Tov, the Rebbetzin attended the shul at 770, and after davening, she would go to the Rebbe's room to wish her son a good Shabbos or good Yom Tov. When the Rebbetzin left, the Rebbe would always see her to the door and watch until she disappeared from sight. This was the great kibbud of Rabbeim that you saw. In 1952, in England, Rabbi Yisrael Aryeh Leib, the Rebbe's brother, passed away very young. The Rebbe knew how much agmas nefesh, how much difficulties his mother had been through, and he felt that word of his passing would just break her completely. In 1952, it was easier to keep things confidential, so he made sure that his mother wouldn't know about it. In those days, the only shiva shoes were white tackies. He had someone paint them with black polish so that it wasn't recognizable. He also kept his visits very short during shiva. The Rebbe's brother would write to the Rebbetzin from time to time. The Rebbe was the one to bring in the post. There was the post box downstairs that the Rebbe had the key to. and he decided not to let his Rebbitzin, his mother, know of her passing. In fact, I'm told that he would censor the letters. If anything came in any of the letters, he wouldn't pass them over. Were words of consolation. On one of his visits, the Rebbitzin asked our Rebbe. His mother asked him, "I've stopped hearing from your brother. I hope everything is okay." Our Rebbe knew his brother's handwriting. He began writing letters in his brother's handwriting, sending them to his Hasidim in Liverpool, that they should put it in an English envelope and stamp that'll be postmarked. And those letters were sent to the Rebbitzin. And on the visits, she would tell our Rebbe what she had heard from her son. The amazing, amazing Kibud Avraham that he showed until 1964. And now the book goes into a discussion about 770, one of the most famous addresses, I would say, definitely in the Jewish world. It was built in one of the main avenues in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, which was a very prestigious community in those days. A wealthy New York physician built it in 1930s. It is sturdy, well designed, made of top grade special order materials, as if the physician had known the crucial role his house would one day play in the future. The handsome Anastasia's house is made of red brick with a pointed roof executed in the Gothic styles. The heavy oak doors with brass handles highlight the house's design. There are several trees. The previous Rebbe managed to buy that house shortly after his arrival in New York, and Crown Heights in those days was one of the most prosperous Jewish areas in New York. The previous Rebbe burst onto the carefree world of American Jewry like an accuser and a prophet. His goal was to convince everybody that adherence to Jewish lifestyle must not be different in America from Eastern Europe in the old days. Since the first day that 770 became the world headquarters of Chabad, the building has been the launching pad for a tireless campaign aimed at preventing assimilation and ensuring that Jews remain Jews. There's 3 stories in 770. The second story houses the apartment of the previous Rebbe. Above that is the apartment of the Rashad, Rabbi Shmayahu Gerari, and the rest of the home consists various institutions of the Chabad headquarters. When the Rebbe came to New York, the previous Rebbe gave him an office on the first floor, the entrance. It's a small, modestly furnished room. There, the Rebbe would spend 15 to 20 hours a day. As I say, from 1941 till 1994, except for those times that he went to Paris to bring his mother. He would write, study holy books, reading, replying to letters and telegrams. From that little office, no one could believe. Those who came to the office for the first time couldn't believe how someone could lead a worldwide struggle against assimilation, issue instructions to all his shluchim dispatched to the 4 corners of the world, and this entire enterprise is part of a wonderful process set in motion by our Rebbe to bring about Moshiach and heralding the redemption. There is a reception room near it called the Maskiros room, where the secretaries sit. It is, they say, measures 18 square yards. The room is cluttered with piles of papers, newspaper clippings, brochures, books, letters. There are 2 desks with typewriters and a couple of phones, and that's all. These phones, he says, deserve special mention. If there was a global competition for the greatest number of incoming calls, these telephones would definitely take first prize. They ring non-stop from morning to midnight, except on Shabbos and Yom Tov. An endless stream of visitors navigate the small area that is free of mailbags, desks, and piles of paper. Throughout this whole commotion are the Rebbe's secretaries, Rabbi Leibel Groner and Benjamin Klein. They are usually poised with one hand clutching a stack of letters, the other holding a pen, a telephone receiver wedged between the shoulder and the cheek, and the right hand on the typewriter. The left hand sorts a huge stack of letters addressed to the Rebbe. Their ears are invariably glued to a telephone receiver. Don't forget, this is before cell phones. Sometimes 2 phones at a time. Think of what these rabbis went through. They spent only a few hours a week with their families. On Shabbos or when the Rebbe went home. As long as the Rebbe was in 770, that office was open. The secretaries' entire lives revolve around the Rebbe's schedule. They work for years without a single vacation, not even for a day or a mere hour, to take care of their private matters. Day and night, including Shabbos and Yom Tov, they are on duty. Naturally, this kind of unflagging effort required not only self-sacrifice on their part, but on the part of their wives and children. It is told that once Rabbi Benjamin Klein's young daughter came into the Maskiros office and quietly stood in the corner. They asked, one of the visitors said to her, "What are you doing here?" She says, "Nothing. I just came to look at my father." On the ground floor is a tiny room at the end of 770, no larger than an average size closet. That was the office of Rabbi Chaim Mordechai Isaac Chadekov, the Rebbe's personal secretary and head of the Center of Jewish Education. Right next to that room is a broadcaster center, and from there, radio and television broadcasts of Farbrengens are transmitted to the entire world. If you look at the big shul downstairs of 770, you might see a little hole on the wall, and that was an opening. In fact, Rabbi J.J. Hecht would sit on a table, on a chair, with a pen and paper, and he'd look through that hole to see the Farbrengen and translate it and tell what it's all about. And that floor has a small shul where the Rebbe prays on weekdays, and then you go down, and they managed to expand 770 throughout the apartment buildings all the way to the end of the street. This shul is probably one of the most populated shuls in the world. On a Yom Tov, you can have, when the Rebbe was there, over 5,000 people in that shul. Other shuls might be much bigger, have comfortable benches. But here there's only a few seats Most of the people have to stand, and you can hear so many different uh, things going on. 770 is truly a place that was going 24/7. I recall as a bacher, 770 seemed like the light of the world. Even when I went away for Pesach overseas, I couldn't wait to get back to 770. Crown Heights are used by Hasidim as code words. During the 40s and 50s, Crown Heights was a very respectable Jewish neighborhood, and they lived in tranquility with 200,000 other Jews, both religious and secular. There were many other rebbes who lived in Crown Heights at the time. If I'm not mistaken, there was Modjic, Bobov, and others. But in the 1960s, population began to change. And there were riots in 1964 where burglary and murder became common. Life in the neighborhood became quite dangerous. People were afraid to leave their homes, and Jews began to leave Crown Heights, to Bow Park, to Flatbush, to other places. People just vacated their apartments, abandoned their stores. Homes were left empty and were taken over by the homeless. Finally, the Hasidim began to lose their nerve. And they said, Rebbe, we can't go on like this. Let us gather the entire community and move somewhere else, like the other Rebbes have done. The Rebbe's reply was unexpected but adamant. Out of the question, he said. We are staying. A Jew has no right to retreat before a non-Jew. A proud Jew does not run away. He digs in to defend his rights. If we submit and concede our defeat, the goyim around us will hound us with redoubled zeal. And if a Jew stands firm, they'll yield and offer peace. And this is always the case with everyday life. And the guy writes, it is the same here in Crown Heights as in the land of Israel or in South Africa. This is the place where my father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, the leader of our generation, lived and worked for 10 years. Here's where he davened, studied Torah with his Hasidim. We will never leave, no matter what happens. Many things it went through. And by the way, the houses went down to basically nothing. You could pick up a house there, even an apartment building sometimes, for the price of just paying the unpaid levies to the city. Today, homes there, anyone who bought it in those days, homes there are worth hundreds of thousands, close to millions. And today, Baruch Hashem, talking about in 2021, Crown Heights is kept as an example of how people can live together in peace. There are stores there written in Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, and every corner has a shul, a mikveh, a bookstore, and there is 24 hours going on there. And we know how the Rebbe started Simchas Beis Hasheva on Sukkot. That is every night of Chalamoid Sukkot. They take over the whole Kingston Avenue is blocked off, and they sing and dance throughout the night. On Erev Shabbos, you can hear the sirens going off. Now, he goes on to describe a Farbrengen. A Farbrengen with the Rebbe had over 5,000 people standing in densely packed room. Elders stand side by side with beardless youth, men with capotes standing next to long-haired hippies who may have donned a yarmulke for the first time in their lives. Farbrengens are held on certain Shabbosim and on Yom Tovs, and also special dates of the Chabad calendar, like the 19th of Kislev and Yud Shvat. And towards the later years, there were hookups in Israel, France, Australia, Brazil, even in Moscow. I remember in the hookups in South Africa, where we would get up at 3 o'clock or whenever it was and go to the Chabad house in Yovel to listen to the Rebbe's Farbrengen live. They were also broadcast on American cable TV. As a rule, it wasn't like that in the earlier years, but in the later years, when I say the later years, already in the late 50s, the Farbrengen started at 1:30. And depending on the season, winter or summer, a Farbrengen could last 3, 4, 5 hours even. 1:30, the Rebbe would walk in briskly, he would make Kiddush, and people would have l'chaim. The Rebbe would look around. Everyone had this little wine cup with wine, holding out their hand to the Rebbe. He would look around and he would say to each person, l'chaim ulevracha. The Rebbe's speeches were constant. He would discuss Torah, Gemara, Rashi, Zohar, his father's commentary, the Rambam, and in the summer also Pirkei Avos. And at the end of every one of his sikhs, he would offer practical conclusions and instructions, because he said, Hamaisahu ha'ikar, the main thing is the action. The Rebbe, in the course of a single Farbrengen, could quote hundreds of passages from Torah, Rashi, Rambam, Kabbalah, every possible Jewish thinker, never ever using a note. If you think about it, a lecture usually carries all these notes and books, and it's on one topic. The Rebbe discusses dozens of topics at once, quoting verbatim from hundreds of sources for hours on end, all done from memory. And during that time, he can speak for up to 5 hours without tiring, barely touching any food or drink. And as Rabbi Masinta mentioned, after that, to stand the entire night giving out tanyas, which was simply mind-boggling. By the way, during the weekdays, there would be tape recordings of the Rebbe's Farbrengens, but on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you had people. First amongst them was Rabbeim Khan, the Rebbe's Chayzer. He would stand in front of the Rebbe, listening to every word. And on Mitzvah Shabbos, he would sit with a few others and some other people who came to hear it. They would repeat the Rebbe's Farbrengen, word by word. Some people taking shorthand would write it down, and then they would print the Rebbe's talks, which Baruch Hashem we have till today. The next topic he goes into is Yechidus. Until 1977, the Rebbe received people privately in his study. There were originally 3 times a week, then it went to twice a week. Sometime it started at 8 p.m. and went to 4, 5, 6 in the morning. The Rebbe managed to receive an average of 50 people per night. You could wait for Yechidus for months. Amongst those who came for Yechidus with the Rebbe were presidents of Israel, heads of the Israeli government, top military officials, ministers, Knesset members, senators from various countries, poets, writers, journalists, and of course, plain, ordinary Jews known in Hebrew as Amcha. Also, quite a few non-Jews had Yechidus with the Rebbe as well. To prepare for Yechidus with the Rebbe, a chassid would go to the mikveh, put on a gartel, study the Rebbe's writings, and fast all day. When you entered the Rebbe's room, you wouldn't shake the Rebbe's hand so as not to reduce this momentous event to the level of a simple meeting. Throughout the conversation, the visitor would remain standing out of respect for the Rebbe and to emphasize the special significance and holiness of the occasion. Many people who had Yechidus would tell that this was a turning point in their life. Within moments, the Rebbe was able to break through the outer shell and penetrate the innermost worlds, making an acute diagnosis of the person's mental and spiritual state and propose a solution. And that is why many, many years after their Yechidus, people would remember every facet, every small detail of that encounter, realizing that every word spoken by the Rebbe remains in effect for years and becomes a compass that guides one's life. One of the people who describes what a Yechidus was like was Eli Wiesel. By the way, this Eli Wiesel, as everybody knows, a Holocaust survivor, was encouraged by the Rebbe to get married and have a child. And he says, never in my life have I seen such an expressive face, such eyes. They radiate a kind of stern, stimulating, and at the same time, calming and comforting force. They are imbued with iron willpower. For a fleeting moment, you are afraid. There's a feeling that his look can annihilate. Yet you immediately feel that this look supports and uplifts you. What inconsolable sorrow it contains. Many years have passed, says Eliezer, since my first visit to the Rebbe. And yet I have a feeling that these eyes follow me every step of the way and read my innermost thoughts. The Rebbe received people from every part of the world, from every strata of society, from every field of endeavor. Everyone acknowledged the immeasurable greatness of this man. The Rebbe never differentiated between ordinary people and dignitaries. You can have an ordinary Jew spending a half hour with the Rebbe. An important figure, tycoon, might be given to understand that the audience is over after a mere minute. The Rebbe always gave his full attention to any problem brought to him. He emphasized with his visitor, shared in his suffering, felt his pain. Poor Jews would complain about their difficulties finding shidduchim for their daughters. Israeli prime ministers discussed the problems facing the state of Israel. From the time that the Rebbe became Rebbe, he never stepped foot outside New York except to go to a summer camp 3 times. And knowing this, visitors were astonished by the Rebbe's knowledge of every possible subject. By the way, I once heard a story of a Yerushalmi, a person who was born in Jerusalem, lived there his whole life. He was an elderly man, and he came to the Rebbe for Yechidus, and he told the Rebbe that it's becoming too difficult for him to walk around in Yerushalayim and to get to his customary shul because of the steps and the hills of Yerushalayim. And the Rebbe suggested to him, why don't you rather take this direction? He told him step by step which way to go from his house to the shul. And when he got back and he tried the Rebbe's way, he found it was so much easier and he was able to do it. And here was a man who was born there, lived in Yerushalayim his whole life. The Rebbe was never there, and yet he knew it, the streets of Yerushalayim, better than a person who was there his whole life. He was able to talk to each person on his own level, specialized language, all different languages, discussing physics with physicists, literature with writers, painting with artists. There are many stories, including with Nachshon, when the Rebbe went around with him to look at all his art that he brought to the apartment building next to 770 and discuss it. He was able to discuss military strategy with army officers, business with economists, professional expertise, and a full knowledge of recent developments in whatever area was under discussion. One diplomat recounted that the Rebbe analyzed the situation as if he had access to the latest Secret Service intelligence reports. A famous nuclear scientist said the Rebbe's knowledge in the field of nuclear physics is so profound, one might think he was a physics professor at Princeton University. Israeli Brigadier General Van Pecker was astonished when he was asked by the Rebbe why Israeli warplanes had bombed Syrian airfields from a certain angle rather than another. The Rebbe was of the opinion that the chosen bombing angle was incorrect, and the second in command of Israel's Air Force had no choice but to agree. A famous newly observant professor of microbiology once delivered to the Rebbe at his request 40 volumes of scientific reports commissioned by the American government space agency in connection with the moon landing. The professor was convinced that the Rebbe wouldn't have time to read through all that extensive research. Several months later, during another Yechidus, the professor was astounded when the Rebbe casually pointed out a serious contradiction between a conclusion reached in volume 18 and another in volume 38. A professor of physical engineering told the Rebbe about a certain scientific invention and the highly complex computations that would result in a pilot device based on the invention. The professor presented the Rebbe with a series of typical numbers obtained in the course of the research. The Rebbe instantly noted that two of the numbers were mutually exclusive. The professor objected. He said all the calculations had been done on the large university supercomputers, and the program had been designed in accordance with the latest infallible theories. The Rebbe smiled and said, despite his enormous respect for the experts, those two numbers were mutually inconsistent. As a result, an entire team of scientists began to search for the error. It took 2 years until a fault was discovered in one of the formulas that the people had entered into that program. How does one explain these unique abilities possessed by the Rebbe? Can there ever be a rational, logical explanation? We probably will never know for certain. Certainly, the Rebbe's secular knowledge, extensive as it might be, does not explain his intuitive ability to answer such questions in almost every field. art, economics, physics have not been the Rebbe's top priorities. The Rebbe was truly concerned with one thing only: bringing Jews closer to Judaism, the Torah, and the Creator. Mishlei says, "B'chol drochecha da'ehu." In all your ways, you should know Hashem. Accordingly, the Rebbe believes that knowledge, science, literature, art, or any other secular field, if that will help and unite the Jews, that knowledge should be used. And so we end tonight's broadcast. We will carry on in Yirtzeh Hashem next week, starting with the Rebbe's daily routine. I hope you find this series on the Rebbe inspiring, and let us, as the Rebbe always said, bring it to action. Learn the Rebbe's, especially as we come up to Yud Aleph Nisan. Let's learn something of the Rebbe. There are many shiurim you could get today on webinars, on YouTubes. Let us increase something to the Rebbe's actions and to help bring Mashiach as we go towards Yud Aleph Nisan. Thank you, Rabbi Masinta, for the opportunity, and thank you to everyone for listening.
And Rabbi Kalaba, thank you to you, and really we look forward to hearing the Rebbe's daily routine next week, and a good vach to everybody.
Yeah.